Okay, I'm going to say a bit more later on about how the moral philosophy and the storytelling get merged in the novels. But I do need to say something briefly at this point about the style and the technique of these novels. They were not the kind of novels that other novelists were writing in the 20th century. And they're not the kind of novels that many people think that Iris Murdoch is writing now. She was labelled continuously as a realist writer, which she is. She does follow in the great tradition of George Eliot and Thomas Hardy, and she uses the realist novel to encourage moral engagement with the novels. However, she was much more of an experimental writer than critics realised at the time, or critics realise today, I think. What she says she wants to do is write a new vocabulary of experiences. She wants all the senses to be stimulated. She doesn't want you just to be engaged with the novels emotionally and intellectually. She wants you to be engaged sensually with the novels. She says if no sensual experience is present, no art is present. So she borrows mainly from two sources here. The French experimental writer, Raymond Queneau, with whom she fell in love when she was working in Europe in the 1940s, in terms of his narrative techniques. He wrote a book, 99 Perspectives on One Incident. So Iris Murdoch's generally are third-person narratives, except for 6 novels, which are first. So there's 20 third-person narratives and 6 first-person narratives. These third-person narratives have narrative perspectives that come from many, many different areas, from outside the characters' minds. So she's experimenting continually with different points of view. And I think this is something that I've only fully appreciated within the last few years, how you have to keep very alert and aware to narrative perspectives in the novels. She jumbles things up, she jumbles up perspectives in ways that keep you on your toes. You constantly have to be engaging with the novels to work out where this narrative perspective is coming from. The other major influence is Henry James. Henry James was an important writer in terms of the tradition of the British knowledge, in that he stands on the cusp between realism and modernism. Henry James was the first writer to extensively use aesthetics, symbols, images to convey meaning. And of course, this was picked up by the modernist writers. Now, I can only suggest really briefly here what I think you should be looking for in the novels. But the first thing, surely, is symbols. Many of the titles of the novels have symbols: the bell, a rose, a net, the sea. The novels are saturated in symbolism, and meaning comes out of these symbols, but not in any kind of straightforward way. Most symbols have a direct meaning, and they also mean the opposite of that direct meaning. So she, for example, in The Bell, 1958, one of her most famous novels, because it has as a central character a homosexual teacher who falls in love with one of his pupils. The symbolism of the bell in this novel is a symbol of both high eros, Michael Meade's desire to be a better man than he is, his desire to do the right thing, to act properly, and also his failure. So the bell in this novel begins high up in the steeple and ends below the lake. And then a new bell comes in and sinks into the lake and then has to be raised up again. This duality of her symbolism, that is once high eros and low eros, and the way these symbols are fluid and they change. You get used to reading them in this way, but they enrich the novels hugely, and they don't function as symbols in any simple way as many other writers use symbols. The imagery in the novels also works powerfully as a narrative to help us see what goes on in the heads of her characters. This is a little bit more complicated, the way that she uses images, and I'm just going to give you one example. 1954, in Under the Net, Jake Donahue is a young man full of joie de vivre, striding through his life with lots of girlfriends, one of whom kicks him out of his flat, and he ends up homeless. So he thinks, well, I need somewhere to stay tonight. I know. I will go back. I will find the real love of my life, his old girlfriend, Anna Quentin. She's a singer. She has a dark, syrupy voice that reminds him of something very spiritual. He says Anna was very spiritual, compliant. And this is how he describes Anna, whom he's going out to find now to see if she will take him back. And he says, Anna, she is deep and unfathomable. Her face is tenderly moulded from within, a face full of yearning, yet poised upon itself, without any trace of discontent. Now, without any flagging up of any kind of reference to the readers, she is borrowing directly from a very famous description by a man called Walter Pater in a book called The Renaissance of an incredibly famous painting. The painting is probably very well known to all of you. It is the ideal woman that every man sees when he looks at this painting. He sees the woman of his dreams. And it is, of course, La Gioconda, Leonardo da Vinci's Mona Lisa. She's relying, what Murdoch is doing here is calling up this image without any kind of actual reference and relying on the language and the lyricism of the prose to call up this image. And even if it doesn't work, this image of this sacred image of womanhood that Jakes holds in his head should alert the reader to the fact that she doesn't exist. This is a fictional view of femininity that all men carry around with them. She's trying to educate, particularly her male readers, that the image of femininity that men see is very often constructed. Generations of Western art has subscribed to this compliant, mysterious, spiritual image of womanhood that Jake sees when he thinks of Anna. He actually chases halfway around Paris looking for her because he thinks he's caught a glimpse of her, and when he finds her, he finds just a pair of shoes. There's no Anna there at all. No women can ever fit this bill. This is a construction of femininity constructed by male ideology that women simply cannot and should not fit into. So it's an extraordinarily complicated and clever way of building images into the novel, and it's a great deal of fun finding them and working at them and trying to work out what she's doing with them. So her use of the visual arts and paintings in this way, she builds paintings into the novels very often. Real paintings that at the time she tended to choose paintings that were in the National Gallery. They form central features in the novel. Characters walk into art galleries and look at paintings. Rembrandt, Giorgione, Gainsborough. There's a very, very famous incident in The Bell where Dora Greenfield walks into the National Gallery and sinks to her knees in front of Gainsborough's beautiful portrait of his two little daughters. And she has some kind of revelation in front of that painting. Now, we haven't got time to go into any more detail about the paintings. They are all still there. In fact, Gainsborough's portrait of his daughters is still in the same place where Dora went to see it when Iris Murdoch was writing about this book in 1958, and I've taken generations of students and we've stood there and looked at this painting. What you can do, of course, is just go to Google and type in Gainsborough, the painting of his two daughters, and it will come up on screen. And this will go for many, there are many paintings and many references to painters in the novels that you are much more fortunate than readers in the 1950s. You can go and find out and look at them and see and try and work out what function they're serving. And they do serve specific functions in the novels. Related to this use of art and paintings, her use of colour. There is a colour code running through these novels. When she describes clothes, the way that people are dressed is very, very specific, and it carries meaning in this attempt to bring sensuous emotional responses from her readers. Green characters tend to be courageous, blue characters are spiritual, khaki, brown characters, stalwart, loyal friends, gold characters, particularly ladies with golden hair and a chignon, deceitful, conniving. Yellow characters, particularly gentlemen who would probably wear a yellow silk cravat. Avoid them like the plague. They are evil, dangerous characters. She's playing with this idea of colour here. And again, yellow characters and green characters, they can all be the opposite of what they are portraying. Readers are kept on their toes all the time. But there is something going on about the communication of inner qualities, inner life, inner compulsions, that she's using all these techniques to try and get the reader to engage with in her characters. A few other things she borrows from drama and the stage, particularly in the later novels, long sections of dialogue, and then sections that will induce tension, emotion, excitement, action in the novels, borrowing from dramatic, as if you were reading these books as if they were plays and being performed in front of you on the stage. The novels are saturated with music. Characters listen to Tchaikovsky, Murdoch, Mozart, operas, songs, chants. And again, all this adds to this sensuous, sumptuous feeling that you get from the novels. Sometimes the novels will actually, the narrative will lapse into poetry when she is trying to tell the greatest truths that she has to tell. She will slow down the action, and the language will start to fall into cadences, often a vague sort of assonance or rhyme. So all these things add another dimension to the novel, to the meaning of the novel, and I think critics, sadly, even now, have not yet analysed her experimentation deeply enough. And as such, one of her greatest achievements as a novelist has not yet been fully recognised.